Good evening. Before we do anything else, maybe could join me in saying a big welcome to Kimberly Wilson, Les Zaitz, and Inara Verzemnieks. So the reason they're here, and I hope the reason you're here, is for the second installment in Oregon Humanities 2018-2019 Think and Drink series. And this series is themed around journalism, justice, and democracy, which feels weirdly timely. And so the way it's going to happen, just to give you a sense of what's coming, is we're going to hear from these three folks for about an hour. Then we'll open up this microphone over here for questions from you. And then when we formally close the program, we're going to invite you to hang around, eat some small food that's in the back of the theater, and talk to each other. Talk to people you came with, people you didn't know, but hang out for a while and keep talking. One of the reasons we're very excited about having these three folks here is that they share some things. They all worked for the Oregonian, as did many other people here. They all have done work that has been recognized by Pulitzer Prize as finalists. They have all been working on a project with emerging journalists called Emerging Journalists Community Stories, where they've been paired with an earlier career journalist to work on a story together. And maybe I should just say that those three emerging journalists, I hope, are here: Emily Prado, Caitlin May, and Intisar Abioto. So. And then the fourth of many, but the last thing I'll name that they have in common is that they are all here right now, which is good news, and we weren't sure it was going to happen. So before we jump into conversation, I want to thank a couple of the organizations that made this possible, and then I want to ask you some questions to help give Kimberly, Les, and Inara a sense of the room. So for starters, this is part of an initiative put on by Andrew Mellon Foundation, Pulitzer Prizes, and the Federation of State Humanities Councils that is called For Better or Worse, Democracy and the Informed Citizen. There are good things about that name, things we could probably argue with about that name, but that's the name of the initiative, and we're delighted it exists. We want to say a big thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities, even if there is no one staffing it now to hear that thanks. I do mean the thanks, and it will be back. The Oregon Cultural Trust is staffed and alive and well, and we want to thank them as well. Yes. A little bit closer, Stoll Reeves, Tonkin Torp, Northwest Natural, and the Kinsman Foundation. A big thanks for helping support this. Our media sponsors for this event about media are Bridgeliner, which if you haven't checked out Bridgeliner, it's a really interesting model as we're thinking about journalism, and X-Ray FM also, so thank you to both of you. And then the Agora Journalism Center and City Club of Portland, community partners on this. Thanks a ton for helping get the word out about this. Really appreciate it. I didn't have this on my sheet, but I want to say also thank you to many of you who do so much to support lots of the work that we're engaged in, and I just want to say a big thanks for that. It means a ton. Some questions. Please respond with applause or other kinds of volume-generating activity. If this is your first Oregon Humanities Think and Drink, could you make a little noise? Good. Welcome, thank you. If you've been to more than one Oregon Humanities Think and Drink, could you make a little noise? Okay. Good, all right. We're glad all of you are here. If you spend at least 15 minutes a day consuming news of some kind, could you make a little noise? If you have worked in some way in media or journalism, could you make a little noise? Wow. And what about if you used to work in media but don't anymore? Okay, last question before we start, and it's a little, we'll see, I'm curious about this. If you think media and journalists should be objective, could you make a little noise? Okay, all right, great. Let's jump in, and maybe just for starters, just as we get going, where do you get your news? And maybe, Kimberly, we could start with you. Where do you get news from?
In the morning when I wake up, it's Twitter. Twitter gives me, it used to be the way that I would curate my news in the morning before I even got out of bed. Lately, it's where I basically read the comment sections of what used to be online newspapers. That's what I get in Twitter, along with my news. So I end up very angry by the time my feet hit the ground. But, yeah.
All right, so you start
my
with
day
Twitter.
starts, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, with reading the stories that are linked to, not just reading them.
So Twitter as a feed to these
As a
other
feed, yeah.
things. Yeah. Les, how about you? Where do you get your news?
Well, I've got a regimen in the morning where I look at probably half a dozen news sites, starting with Oregon Live, of course. I'll send you my bill for the promotion. And then, I look at the New York Times and the Washington Post, the LA Times, and then different papers around Oregon, just to get a national perspective, a regional perspective, and a local.
Okay, thank you.
I'm living in Iowa City now, and I felt like part of my tax in terms of becoming a resident of that area was to subscribe to all of the local newspapers. So I subscribe to 3 papers that represent the region, and I actually get up and go get and read the 3 hard copies. That's the first thing I do in the morning. Yeah, seriously. And then usually in terms of other readings, because I am dealing with so much reading of student papers, I actually depend on my friends and what they're posting in social media in terms of like brilliant long-form features or things that I should pay attention to outside of what the local news might be.
And maybe we'll keep getting into this as we go, but just even in these opening comments, some sense that, for example, you said you're in Iowa and you're teaching nonfiction writing now. Les, you're out in Eastern Oregon, working with the Malheur Enterprise, also started a paper out of Salem recently, the Salem Reporter. Kimberly, now you're at Meyer Memorial Trust as Director of Communications. So it's interesting thinking at some point journalism as we traditionally understand it, and now different forms, or doubling down in a way. But I want to go to the begin, rather than where you are now, I wonder if we could go back a little bit and why did you want to do journalism in the first place? How did that develop as something you did or wanted to do? And whoever wants to take that first.
Yeah, explain yourself, Kimberly.
Mine is going to be the least interesting story. I actually didn't want to be a journalist. I just wanted to write. That's all I wanted to do. And I was trying to think of jobs that I could get away with just writing. And I didn't work at a high school paper. I didn't work at my college paper. And short story, I ended up with 2 job applications that kind of seemed promising. One was at the Associated Press in DC, and the other was at the World Bank. And I still wonder what my life would have been like if I took that job. But I got the job at the AP. It was an assignment working at the White House, covering Bill Clinton's jogs in the morning. And it was a death watch. They were afraid that it was. It was about 6 months into his first term, and all of the senior reporters were exhausted because he would work very, very early. He would get up very early in the morning to go for a jog, and he would work until 3 in the morning. And they were like, we have to bring in some flunkies to take this morning shift. And I was the AP flunky, and and I got the bug from the experience of actually doing journalism. So.
Great, thanks for starting us. Yeah, Inara, do you want to?
So I was raised by refugees from Latvia, and in my particular case, what I learned very early on growing up in their household was that stories were the only way that we could access their lost home. And their stories of their life, their childhoods, the people they left behind, it really impressed upon me what it meant to not only preserve those stories, but to listen, to hear them, to be the one to listen and hear. And so that, I just think, got me thinking very early on about the importance of listening and hearing and being witness for other people's stories. And I think at some point someone must have given me the word that what I wanted to do was to be a journalist. And my parents actually have one of those things that you would do in like 3rd grade, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I had written reporter and drawn like a really terrible typewriter, and I pursued that with single-mindedness, really. I made a paper, a local newspaper when there wasn't one. I worked for my high school paper, I worked for my college paper, got internships, really felt that that was what I always wanted to do. And for me, what was the really critical part of it was the chance to work what I like to think of as the sofa beat. The opportunity to be able to go into people's homes and sit on their sofas and witness their everyday lives.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I grew up in a newspaper family, and I was the oldest of 5 kids, and I was my father's printer's devil when he had a high-type newspaper in Kaiser many years ago. And I think the first formative experience I had was that the volunteer fire department was just across the street from the office. And the siren would go off, and Sam Ork at the grocery would come running and throwing his apron off, and Larry Ham from the gas station would be running down the hall, and they'd jump in the truck and take off. And I'm like 11 years old or so, and my dad said, well, when they get back, go find out what happened. Well, so I trundled across the street, and, what'd you guys do? And I thought it was so cool that I could go find out about information, because that made me really cool with all my friends, because I knew what was going on, and they didn't. In high school, my second formative experience was as I was a junior in high school. I heard a choir teacher complaining that she couldn't buy new robes for her students this year because the athletic department was over budget and spending money. And I didn't know a thing about budgets, but something didn't sound right about that. And the athletic director back then, a guy by the name of Denny Peters, was like 6'4", 280 pounds. He'd been a linebacker at OSU, big burly man. And I just made an appointment to come and interview Mr. Peters about what was going on with his budget. And I don't know how I knew it, but I knew I should record this interview. Well, I went down to the library and said, I need to check out a tape recorder. Well, the only thing they had was one of those huge reel-to-reels. And so I'm carrying this 30-pound tape recorder down to the athletic director's office, and I put it on the desk in front of him, click, and start asking him questions. And the fact that he responded to the questions with some discomfort sort of set me on the path of, quizzing people in power about things they shouldn't be doing is a lot of fun. I'm going to keep this up.
So it feels like there's a lot in those 3 answers, from sort of I want to write to I want to hear and tell other people's stories, maybe especially the stories of your family, but it's twice you also said other people's stories, and then less, it seems like 2 things. I mean, you said I wanted to know what happened, and then you started talking about power, mainly in the form of Mr. Peters, which is a vivid image for power. But I guess as you think about the work now, whether you're doing it or not, when you think about this work, like which of those feels like the real driver in the work? Is it wanting to know what happened and knowing a little more? Is it telling other people's stories, writing, power? Where does it really, what drives it?
Well, I'll take a run at that.
Great.
Get it out of the way. For me, even to this day, the responsibility that journalists have to hold those in power accountable for how they use their power, how they use their money, our money, whether they work for government, run a corporation, run a nonprofit, it is so fundamental to our society that those people know that there are journalists who are skilled and willing and patient enough to ask them hard questions, to make them explain what they're doing with the public trust that they have. And as we've seen the erosion in the core of journalism, that's even more important, because if we let those in power escape that kind of scrutiny, the results are not going to be good for any of us.
Can we just follow a little bit? Is it okay to follow a little? I mean, I don't know that I fully see it. Like, how do you hold people to power by asking them questions?
You
That's
should
for
watch
anyone.
him interview.
Okay,
Elected for-
great.
I mean, you have a stake in it. You asked the audience whether or not they thought that journalism should be objective. And that's certainly the school that everybody went to become a journalist, right? The idea that objectivity is what marked you as a serious journalist, or as a real journalist. But we also have a stake in this world, and I think that that's an important element that you bring. So the accountability is important because it's going to affect everyone, and you're part of that. And you need to have the drive to get to the bottom of things and ask questions that are uncomfortable, that will make you uncomfortable, that will make other people uncomfortable, to get the answers that people need to actually be comfortable. And so, yeah, I think Les is right, and it's vitally important.
Do you think about power in your work either now or when you were doing the work in the trenches daily?
I absolutely think that it's always about power and thinking about what we do to question. I talk with my students about the idea of received stories that we just go ahead and kind of have given to us, and we might just kind of accept without ever once kind of prodding them, considering them from a different angle. But I want to say, too, that another aspect of power is recognizing not just the voice you have, but maybe the voice that we don't let other people have, and how we go about making sure as journalists that we focus on that as well.
So there's some nodding and some like audible nodding to that. So can you say more about voice? Who tells which stories, why, that sort of thing?
It's been really fascinating for me working in a program, in the nonfiction writing program at Iowa, where we essentially define nonfiction under a very broad tent. So we have people coming in who have had years of experience, for example, as foreign correspondents or investigative reporters. But we also have people coming in who are poets who are working in the tradition of documentary poetry, and it's also a lot of research. And we have people who are working as memoirists. And so they're not coming in with a shared assumption about what journalism is and what it should do, which has led to some really fascinating discussions in seminar about, again, that very question: who should tell particular stories? What does it mean to give voice? Which in and of itself can be a kind of problematic statement. But the students themselves will often say, should someone who, for example, doesn't come from a particular community tell that story? And what I've come up with as a kind of sort of rubric for us to talk through is to say, can we agree, for example, that in an ideal world, stories in which communities have the greatest stake would be told by those journalists? And the students, pretty much everyone can kind of agree that that can be an ideal. If we are in a situation where that is not possible and harm could occur to those communities, would it be permissible then from someone who does not come from that community, who possesses the kind of insight and cultural understanding to write about that community, would it be okay for them to do it? And the students usually say yes. So it's thinking in those layered terms.
Les, you've been working out of Eastern Oregon and other parts of the state for a while. Have you run into stories where you thought, not comfortable with the voice that's telling this story, either for yourself or someone else, or is it more about the story itself?
Well, in Malheur County, where the Malheur Enterprise operates, one of the things I discovered early on, having known virtually nothing about that massive territory, was that it was populated with 30% of the population was Latino. Well, that's an interesting demographic, but as I moved around the communities of Nissa and Vail and Ontario, I didn't see that. I didn't see those faces on city councils, at chamber of commerce functions. And so I reached out to the Latino community that I could find and started having conversations directly with them about this. I was very candid about this. Look, I don't know anything about your community here other than it seems to be invisible, and they would just nod their head. And so that's, frankly, has troubled me since the day I got there 2 years ago, is how do we reflect that community that operates invisibly? And I'm very fortunate that this summer we will bring in a reporter on a special project who will be assigned exclusively to learn about this community and to give it a voice that it does not have now, partly for fear, partly because they're just working too hard to feed their kids.
Great, thank you. Kimberly, this question seems like you're dialed into. What are you thinking?
Yeah, we were chatting a little bit in the back about representation, and even just in the last week, it feels like every story that has really captivated me has been a story that has driven home more strongly the idea that representation is vitally important in journalism, both as voices of the voiceless, but also as part of the mainstream. The controversy about CBS's 2020 political news team that's going to cover the election. It was a diverse group of 12 reporters. There were a couple of Latino reporters, there were a couple of Asian reporters, there were women represented, but there were no black people. And they faced controversy for that omission, and the understanding that representation is also about the different kinds of perspectives that it brings, not just having one more person to check off a box. And it matters if you want to get a full story, if you want to get a story maybe that'll teach you something you didn't know, to have it come filtered through somebody whose eyes are not yours and not like yours.
Is it possible to talk about like how that shows up in a story? How the identity of the people doing the reporting, how does that show up in the product?
Can I give you one
Please.
recent example? My mother would like this because she was an AKA, which is a black sorority that just celebrated its anniversary of 100 and something years. And at the anniversary, one of its members, Kamala Harris, was visiting her alma mater, Howard University in Washington, D.C., and she was speaking to a group of her sorority sisters. And the women responded with the sound, which I'll get in trouble if there are any AKs in the room because you're not allowed to do it if you're not an AKA, but whatever, I can't see you. And so the women responded in joy to her by ski-weeing. And so they would make this noise, they would go ski-wee, ski-wee, and it's this really distinctive sound. And they responded to her, and a reporter from the Washington Post was in the room covering this event, a white reporter who wasn't familiar with black sororities, wasn't familiar with the AKA sorority, and heard the sound and was live tweeting this event, and tweeted that, weirdly, the crowd was screeching. and how weird that they would be screeching. And so she says this in her Twitter feed, and then Black Twitter landed on her head. That was the end of it. And it was a real moment of, my behavior, had I been in her shoes, and I was in a room of NRA people, and I heard them making a sound, I wouldn't make an assumption that what I thought I was hearing is what was happening. I would have talked to people and said, it seemed like people were barking. It seemed like people, what was that? Because my ignorance would guide me. Her ignorance didn't guide her. She just made an assumption, and it didn't end up in print, and she deleted the tweets after getting lots of fire for them. But it was an example to me of, it's kind of frivolous in a way, but it's also really, it's part of what you don't get when you don't have representation. Her inexperience and ignorance meant that she offended people, meant that she misunderstood what was happening right in front of her, and she's the filter you're going to get your story about that event from.
It feels like there are at least a couple parts to that. One is the sort of identity, experience, knowledge you would bring into the room or not bring in. But then another, it sounded like, was like do the job well. And I was thinking back to what you said, Inara, about listening to these stories. So how do you listen to a story to get the story that really is the story? How do you know that's what you're getting?
Well, I don't have an answer, but I certainly have, I feel like, questions to guide that process. And I think one goes back exactly to what Kimberly said, which is to not make assumptions, to constantly be realizing that you should be checking everything that you feel that you are perceiving in that particular moment. The difficulty is, and here I'm going to speak quickly, I'm going to make sure I'm speaking to work that you might have a little bit more time with, because it is difficult on deadline. At the same time, it is still possible to check assumptions on deadline. That's not an excuse. But I do believe that being able to spend time with people is absolutely critical, and why I am a real advocate for places supporting long form and immersion reporting, because something happens when you move past parachuting in and seeing something as spectacle and actually sort of humbling yourself and stepping back and saying, I am here to learn, I am here to listen, I am here to understand your world on your terms, and certainly to ask questions, but to not say, I'm going in and I know exactly what I need and I'm gonna get it from you. It's a different kind of positioning. It's saying, I am going to spend time and wait to see what I can learn about what it is to be you.
So, the quickness of the story you tell, the pace there, and then the importance of time, but what's the argument for being quick? Because it seems to me it'd be hard to talk about journalism and media right now without talking about just the pace that we all seem to take for granted with how quickly we get the story. Les, what's your sense of pace and time around this work?
Well, social media and the websites, have dramatically ramped up to speed, but there is still no substitute for getting it right. And there's also no, I want to echo what she said, that there's no substitute for listening. There is always time to listen to the people that you're out learning about. And in Vail, I hired a graduate student, Filipino, and who is covering the Latino community. And it is very interesting to watch her work with this community, with her background and perspective. I suspect that she's asking far different questions than I would ask, and probably hearing different answers than if I were out there with my 30-pound tape recorder. But speed is no excuse for not getting it right, and not getting it right factually, but right as far as context and perspective. And that's what is missing so often from stories, is that context to help understand the why and the what of something.
This is making me think back to the last one of these we did, which was with Eli Saslow and Emily Harris, talking about Eli's book about Derek Black, former white nationalist. And in the room, there was a lot of question about why Eli, in the role of the journalist here, was spending so much time and attention, focusing attention, and listening carefully to Derek Black. It seemed like there was energy around, aren't there other ways to tell this story than having Derek Black's story be the story? Why not tell the story about the friends who helped him change his mind, or the people who Derek's ideology hurt? So how do you know who to tell these stories about? We were talking before about the people telling the stories, but how do you know where to focus them?
Kimberly?
There used to be, and I'll forget his name, but all the journalists in the room will probably know, there was a very famous reporter who was known for going through the phone book, and he would just pick a name, and he could tell a story about anybody. Everybody has a story. Obits show you that every day. They're a source of the lives of the people who are part of your community, who were part of your community until very recently. And they're people who probably never appeared in the newspaper before, maybe on their birth, or maybe at a high school sporting event, and then when they died. So I think on the one hand, everybody's life can be worthy, and if you regard people's stories as something of value, then you don't assume some people have stories that matter and some people don't.
And to add to that really excellent answer, we also have to be careful to do caricatures of people. That even if there are people that we find offensive in some ways, or somehow they're just that we shouldn't regard them, if they're involved in the news, we owe it to the reader to try and help them understand who that person is, what motivates them, why are they saying the things they say, or why are they acting in the way. You don't have to agree with it, but you need to have, these are not cardboard cutouts, right? These are real people, and to me it's always fascinating to sort of get behind that cardboard cutout and find out what's the intricacy of this individual that informs the bigger story.
That seems hard in a lot of ways, and it seems especially hard with some of the pressures that we know. I mean, even the fact that that all three of you used to work for the Oregonian, and the subtext here is many people used to work for the Oregonian and very few do now. And like, how do you, in the face of pressures like that, and that's just one kind of pressure in this work, listening seems to require this kind of full presence, the time you talked about. So how do you put these two together? The real pressures that none of us could deny around this work, and what sounds like the ideal around how the work is done. How do you square those two?
I think those have always been tensions that newsrooms have struggled with. Newspapers still will devote resources to long-form projects that are really important and in-depth, and at the same time, they need somebody to cover the school board meeting and to make it quick, and to tweet about it, and to get into the comments and respond to people who are reacting to the story. So there's really a balance, and I think sometimes it's certain people in the newsroom who are kind of relegated to telling those rudimentary stories that have to be told, and more senior reporters who have the leisure to be able to tell really thoughtful, in-depth stories that require the kind of long-term sitting on the couch kind of footwork and reporting to be able to really get to the nut of a story. And they don't, it's not always that they interact.
Inara, what do you think on this?
I can answer this somewhat indirectly. I was just thinking, I just finished today reading the first round of applicants for next year's graduate class for the nonfiction writing program. And we are seeing a skyrocketing number of people who do have journalism experience or are very into it. And I've tried to figure out in sort of my own armchair analysis, like, what's that about? Is it about, because I will say when I first started as a professor in the program, we were seeing a lot of memoir, and it was rare to see the journalists. And so I'm like, okay, is this a sign that, like, it's valuable to society again? Like, it's going to be trendy again, which I realize is probably ridiculous. What I think instead is happening is that, in particular, like, graduate programs are maybe one of the last forms of patronage that we have to give people 3 years and health insurance to be able to pursue these kinds of projects. And I just want to say a quick shout out to the mentorship program that I was involved in, because that gave Emily, who I worked with, some time and space to be able to pursue a longer term project. That was a form of patronage. I don't have the answers, but one thing I think about a lot in terms of the shakeup of the media landscape is how can we find other ways to be that form of patronage, to give that to people. I mean, these students, let me just say quickly, they're getting, and this is a whole other sort of story of justice or injustice. Students are getting basically $20,000 in health insurance, and that for them is a way to do some really incredible work. So we really should be thinking about that can change lives.
Les, you just took the sort of radical step recently of starting a new kind of publication, right? The Salem Reporter, like, in the face of the pressures and constraints that we just only now started to talk about, how do you decide to do something like that, and what makes you think it's going to fly given all this?
A weak moment.
Okay.
A sleepless night. Frankly, for me, it is part of a mission for journalism that I'm convinced that our society is hungry for sources of credible, accurate information, particularly local news. And my belief to my core is that if we can deliver that information that people find relevant and actionable, and I'm not talking clickbait, I'm talking about intelligent stories about high school graduation rates or a teen homeless shelter opening. Why did it open? Where do we get homeless teens in the first place? That the bargain I'm going to make with the people of Salem is you support us and we will give you the information you want. If you don't support us, we will not be here. It's just that simple. We cannot any longer, it is in essence another form of patronage, that you have to pay professionals to get the kind of professional information you want. Now, whether that works, we'll see.
So you said at the beginning of that comment that you have a mission around it, and it's interesting to think, so what's the hope? Let's say we do find a way to give people the credible, reliable information about the stories that they most have a hunger for. What would be next? Like, where does the journalism part fit into a larger picture?
Go ahead, Kimberly. I know you're busting a gut to jump in.
I think it starts with teaching us to have a better diet, teaching us to consume news in a different way. Because people in Salem or anywhere may click on absolutely anything.
Yes.
But it's really important that they know what's happening with their water bureau. And it's important that they know what's happening with their tax base and what's happening in City Hall and what's happening in the county and what's happening with the law enforcement. These are things that they pay for every day. And there needs to be a way, and there needs to be a sense of connection and obligation and interest on our parts as citizens to consume information we actually need, in addition to the information that we really want. So we may really want to know whatever it is that the Kardashians are doing. It's possible, but we need to know what's going on with the transit system in our community, and we need to know what's happening in our schools. And I think your experiment in Salem is asking readers in Salem to support what they need without offering them the stuff that they might also want.
Well, and more to the point, I think the other experiment with Salem is to try and dial back, frankly, the arrogance of the media that we will tell you what you should know. And that's something I'm very, very sensitive to in this experiment, is listening closely to the community about what are the issues that are troubling people in the community. Not what issue do we pick up at a city council meeting or because the mayor came in, but what do we hear when we go out to a neighborhood association? What is it about the homeless issue that is really making people show up for meetings? It is that connectedness, that engagement, not to simply sort of put our finger in the wind and sort of do popular journalism, but to be more organically connected with the community and reflect the issues that people are worried about and would like to participate in solving.
It's interesting. I feel like there's this kind of tension emerging between listening, which feels like it is really responsive and about paying attention, and then also, especially in Kimberly's comment, there was this sense of a kind of moral imperative or the stuff that people need. Whether they know, it may not be the stuff they want to click on, but damn it, it's what's good for them. Just to put it starkly.
Eat your vegetables.
Yeah, I mean, I recognize that feeling, so I want to... Kimberly, what were you going to say?
I mean, Les is right to call it arrogant. I do think that there's an arrogance to it. But I also think without that information and without that diet, we could find ourselves, hypothetically, in a situation where things have gotten away from us. Mm-hmm. Our elective process might have gotten away from us. The institutions we trust in and expect to always be there as a foundation might get away from us. Offices that are really high in the land might be disconnected from, so there are potential consequences. So
hypothetically.
Hypothetically, yeah.
Could that happen?
Fantasy.
So, I mean, we're in this moment where it is this weird fantasy that's become real, and it's a sort of counter fantasy. So I guess I want to just stay there a little bit on what people seem to want versus what we think might be good.
Well, I'm going to answer this, I think, somewhat indirectly, and I'm just sort of inspired by what Kimberly and Les were saying. I think another component of this that I've been thinking about a lot is also just, and excuse me, I'm going to use a dorky metaphor, but I'm in Portland, so soccer should work. I love soccer, played, coached, and one of the things that's been interesting is to watch the way the game is gained in popularity. And there are many reasons for it, but I'm just going to oversimplify. And I'm going to say something happened at the point when many of the people who grew up playing soccer actually were able to make decisions about watching soccer or putting their children in soccer programs, meaning they understood the beauty of the game. They were familiar with its intricacies, and that made them more appreciative of it. Well, dorky metaphor, but sorry, I feel like to a certain degree it's important that we do this again with journalism. And I'm not saying anything radical here, but I do think, for example, when I teach at Iowa and I teach nonfiction classes, I always, instead of talk about journalism, talk about reporting. On the first day in my undergraduate classes, I give all my students reporters' notebooks. I'm always finding ways to bring in what I think are some of the fundamentals of journalism, even in moments that it might seem somewhat incongruous. And that's just my small way of making sure that people are familiar with what it actually takes to do this work. And I think there are probably better and more brilliant ways to go about it, and there have been efforts over the year, but I think it's a way we need to retrench in thinking about how do we help people understand the beauty and the finesse and the difficulty of what it is that we do.
I feel some anticipated guilt for my next question, because you finished up by saying the beauty and the finesse of what you do, and I want to challenge it just a little bit more just to keep it in front of us and then move back towards that. But the challenge is around the experience, and maybe I'll just describe my own for a minute. The experience of having a bowl of cereal in the morning and grabbing the paper, reading it in a way because I feel like I should, and in a way because it's there and it's telling me stuff that I'm responding to, and then putting it down and going about my day. That somehow I've engaged with the news, and I feel good about myself because I've engaged with the news. And now I can go do what I was going to do anyway. So I just want to put that as what to do with that. The fact, in other words, I like the idea, the soccer analogy, that our engagement with the news might build toward bigger engagement. But sometimes it also looks like it could substitute for engagement. At least in my own experience, it sometimes feels that way. So I just want to put that out here for a minute and see how that strikes you.
Well, I think for me, I guess, and then I'll turn it over, but I think there is a way that you cannot consume that so lightly if you understand, for example, the amount of legwork. You're able to reverse engineer and understand the hours that someone might have put in to write 2 sentences of fact. And if you understand and are introduced to how much work that actually takes, I think even at a sort of subliminal level, you're not able to just sort of say, oh, this is content. This is just something, you understand the sort of blood, sweat, and tears that someone might have to go to be able to have one single quote, one single detail.
Would you repeat your question?
Yeah. Well, thanks. I'll try. I'll try in a short way. I think my question is about what sounds like, in a way, I'm struck by how hopeful all 3 of you sound about the relationship between consuming news and being more likely to engage in meaningful action in the world. And that sometimes I have the feeling that for me, consuming news can be a substitute for action in the world, or something that I can, that can be the thing. I've read the New York Times, now I'll go play soccer.
It's coming back.
Yeah.
So I actually think I have a slightly different take on it. I think that people do engage with news, and I'm grateful for it. And I think that that appetite has not gone away, and that despite what's happened to newspapers, it's been refreshing to see that online news organizations and nonprofit news organizations and all kinds of alternative news organizations have actually flourished over the last 10 years. But at the same time, actually, I don't really see the soccer analogy. I see news and the consumption of news as being almost Pac-Man gobbled up by media, which is not news, which is much of what I do when I wake up in the morning looking for news is media. So the memes that I see and the snarky responses that I see and the back and forth between, you know, this elected official said that and then this is how they responded and it's really catty and it's funny. That's not the news. But that can take up, I mean, if I just uploaded an app that Inara told me about in the back that'll block all of this, so I'm excited about it. After a certain number of time, I just won't have any access to anything. But I do wish that there was an ability to sort of like measure that versus the actual consumption of news. I read news all day long. I read it from all the sources that I trust, whether they're local or whether they're national or whether they're international. But to get to that diet, I eat a whole bunch of bugles, man, of just like wasted, terrible, it's not news media. And yeah, so actually I feel like it's kind of a threat to news.
Yeah, that's a helpful distinction between news and media. I don't know, Les, does that distinction work for you at all? The one between news and media, bugles and whatever the other stuff is?
You listen to her? You know, I think in my judgment, where we will make an impact is with local news. And so when you talk about reading the paper and setting it aside, but if on page 3 of that paper, there is a story about a plan for a 14-story apartment building to go on the backside of your lot, you're going to put the paper down and you're going to pick up a phone and call somebody. Okay. You're going to react. So it is all, you know, life is all relative in perspective and context. And where I think people like me can do the most good is to help you know that you've got a 14-story apartment building coming, unless you do something about it, engage in any way that you want. And I believe that if we do a good job on the 14-story apartment building, well, in other words, you will trust what you read about that, you talk about reverse engineering, we can reverse engineer America's trust in the media from the local on up instead of trying to start with CNN and the Washington Post and build the trust down.
That's nice. So both of you talked about trust. Both of you used the word trust explicitly, and it's in there in the distinction between news and media. It's in there in the distinction between local and national. I guess, are you feeling hopeful about this gets back also to the question of who's producing a story, who's writing it, and like, how do you get someone who's likely to dismiss your story to trust that it might be true or credible?
Well, one way is to be transparent about how you do your job, and you talked about that a little bit, that I think the press has done a terrible job of being open with people about how is it that we gather the information, what steps did we take to gather the information, who did we talk to, what documents did we count on. You can see some of that in major investigative projects, perhaps. But I think if we are, number one, more open with all of you about what it took to get this story and what efforts we took to get it right, that's, to me, a pretty foundational step to beginning to rebuild that trust in that story that you're reading.
I don't want to be flip, but sometimes I feel like I don't know that you are going to change the opinions of the people who are not going to trust you for irrational reasons. So you hold the line. You just have to keep holding the line. For my book, I spent a lot of time immersed in the buildup to World War II in Europe. And one of the things I did was I spent a lot of time in newspaper archives, and it was fascinating and terrifying to see the way that the language of newspapers changed, that it went from very detail-oriented to very abstract. And the abstraction, of course, we know, is when abstraction of language can lead to abstraction of human lives, can lead us to do horrible things. And so for me, I feel like I think to be doing the work where you are trying to resist abstraction and root your stories in the facts and in real life, you have to hold that line, even if there are people shouting at you that they're not going to trust it.
I guess, Kimberly, I want to follow this trust question a little bit towards where you're working now and the work where you're working with the place where the mission and the vision are clear, Meyer Memorial Trust. And I guess I want to ask about, this is getting back to the question about objective journalism or advocacy journalism. And so how, like, when you think about the kind of communicating you're doing now, how is it related to working for the Oregonian, something like that?
Well, it's
No
interesting.
comment?
No, it's interesting. When I first came to Meyer, I would write a press release about something, and I was dismayed to find that it would run in its entirety as a news story in newspapers around the state. And that went on for a couple of years, and I stopped writing news releases because I'm not the source of news. I shouldn't be. And while I wasn't saying anything harmful, and I was just telling you what had happened relating to some grants we made, the reality was it was a responsibility of a newsroom and editors and people who could be critical thinkers and look at and talk to people and interview people to get to what the impact was of these grants. And instead, it would be a story that would say, my headline, Meyer Memorial Trust has awarded $25 million in grants to organizations around Oregon. And maybe it would say, in this county. And then it would just take the rest of the story and follow afterwards. That was really demoralizing.
And how has that, it sounds, in a way you're using past tense verbs. How have you changed your approach to what you're putting out there in response to that sense?
So I left the paper 5 years ago in the midst of this changed media landscape. And it's, from my side of this little group, organizations that do what we do, which is fund things to make this a better place, particularly rooted in equity, there are not a lot of newspapers that are going to write stories about the things that we do, or that are the nonprofits that we support do. I discovered. And so what I have done as an alternative to sending out a press release that talks about Meyer is, and sitting in the front row is our partner in this, we have been seeding stories by offering the legwork for a small newsroom. Here's who you want to talk to. Here are the issues and how they connect in your community. Here's the issues that your community are saying are really important, and so you can, here's the package to tell this story. I think that's important. I don't have a stake in it for Meyer, but as a resident of the state, I have a stake in it. I think these are important issues. And on another note, we fund nonprofit journalism. We have not funded for-profit newsrooms. And I think that's really important. I think that in terms of patronage, philanthropy can be a patron to journalism and to nonprofit reporting outfits in a way that helps to keep one more option available for you to read news and to get a different perspective on a story. And I think that that's really important. So.
Go ahead, Les, sir.
One of the phenomena that's emerged in recent years, too, that follows this line, is that as the number of reporters drops down, particularly in government, we see government operating sort of as news services. They put out newsletters, they're tweeting out information from a school board meeting.
Often written by former journalists.
Yeah, right. But the point is that government agencies increasingly are filling the vacuum of the lack of professional media by government media. And, you know, if it's about, you know, opening a new park in West Salem, you know, there's not much spin to that. But I think we all need to be very, very concerned that if we're going to rely on government to provide us the information about what government is doing, the consequences are not going to be good.
So it feels like there's a strain here, maybe the last tension I'm going to ask about before starting to move towards audience questions, and that is this question about sort of credentialed reporters against more democratized or anyone can report. It seems like I can see arguments for both, but where does your optimism lie there? Where do you put more hope? More on the sort of the good training, building the stories up in the way that make them credible, or we can all tell a story? And that's the tool we have these days, and isn't that great?
Well, I'll just tell you what we are doing at the Malheur Enterprise. I mean, this is one of the smallest newspapers in the state, but I am very concerned about the next generation of journalists who have the skills, the training, and the openness to do this with principle, with ethics. And so last summer, we created 2 internships that were supported by, frankly, donations from a number of my friends and colleagues. Every dime that was donated went to being able to pay an intern a living salary while they're at the enterprise learning how to do this job. And so we have to grow our own and be more diligent about that and more deliberate about passing on and encouraging principled ethical conduct in journalism. You know, this concept that anyone can be a reporter sounds all warm and fuzzy, but it's just not true. It's like saying anyone can be a mechanic. Well, yeah, okay, I can charge a dead battery, but I can't change the timing belt.
Inara, you're working with aspiring writers. What's your thinking about this question around training or voice right off the bat?
Well, I mean, I think it's so layered, and I don't think it's a question of, you know, one or the other or none. I mean, I think it's the ideal is that we have, we're able to hold on to a kind of layered approach to how important stories are told credibly and ethically. In my case, one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot is the question of how our current system does sort of excludes certain people from being able to get that kind of training or access. And so one of the things that, even though it is probably going to play hell on my tenure, hopefully no one on my tenure committee is here, but like, I mean, I tend to say yes a lot if I'm invited to do what I feel like are more open kind of community workshops or classes, so that my sort of knowledge and what I can offer and how I can help mentor and support people is not just isolated within the academy. The other thing that I know that people have talked about in the past, and I don't know how far it's ever gotten, and so maybe it's already happening and I'm not aware, but one of the things that also concerns me is that, yes, there are still journalism jobs, but they you know, are few and far between. I'm disturbed by the idea of students going to journalism school and racking up $100,000 in debt and then being forced to work as contractors. And so there had been discussion at one point in time about figuring out how newspapers might partner with community colleges so that students could get associate degrees and then work with newspapers almost right off the bat as a kind of apprenticeship, and to sort of shift that model so that people could have working wages, be mentored and get the skills they want, but also to not limit access to news jobs to people who can be able to afford to take on that kind of debt load.
I'm gonna go with Inara on this one. I think that anybody can be a journalist, but I think it requires you to be a critical thinker, and I think it requires you to be curious. And as a friend said to me the other day, I think it requires you to be really self-reflective and be able to recognize that as objective, your goal will be objectivity, and you will try to be fair, and you will try to be balanced, and you will still be making a choice every time you're out to cover a fire. What door do you knock on? And you're not making an objective choice about which door you knock on, you're making a subjective choice. And being able to recognize that and own it and move through it and move past it and recognize that it both limits you and it also kind of defines you as being human, I think is really important. So I think that you're seeing in the media, in the different forms of social media, you're seeing people who are basically doing journalism. They're doing nothing different than the journalism that was done in the 1900s. They don't have an ethical framework where somebody's told them this is how you quote somebody. But they do have, as a consumer of news and information, they have a rudimentary idea of how to tell a story, and they're doing it. It is very expensive to go to J school. I don't think you have to go to J school to be a journalist, but you usually have to go to college, and that's a very expensive endeavor. So it does disqualify people who are fully capable of learning on the job, as your interns will do, as I did, and as a lot of the people who are in the room who are who have been or are journalists probably have done. So, yeah, I don't want to get on too high of a horse. It's hard work, but it's fascinating work, and anybody can do it.
So as we get ready to turn to questions, maybe one last question related to where we are in the current moment, and I think what you've been talking about, and that is just sort of, if you had to point toward something that's happening around journalism, or an opportunity related to technology or something in the field, like what do you, something you feel hopeful about related to what you see going on with news and journalism right now? And then while I'm asking that, I should just say there is a microphone over here, and in just a moment we're gonna ask for questions from you, either through that, or I think we're gonna try also to take questions with the help of Bridgeliner through Twitter, I believe, or a number that you can text, which might be behind me that I can't see. So just please have that in mind, start thinking about questions, and then let's go back to this question about a point of hope in this, in the current context around this kind of work.
Well, I'll use this opportunity to make a quick plug. Going back to no, not for me at all, for another journalist whose work I just have really admired in terms of the question of representation and what happens when people from the communities they're writing about are covering the stories from those communities. I had happened upon the podcast Finding Cleo, which is it's very, very heavy material. It's about missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. But the reporter herself is Indigenous. And listening to this podcast is essentially a masterclass in understanding and seeing the kinds of questions and the ways someone would approach this material coming from the community. So simply as an incredible podcast that I think people should listen to, but also for anyone who is interested in thinking through these questions and watching them play out, seeing the process, it's an extraordinary example. And so there are that gives me hope that there are things like that.
Thank you. Les, anything come to mind for you?
I'm hopeful that despite the state of newspaper as a medium, that our paper, The Oregonian, recently made a big investment into long-form journalism and storytelling, and had a project that came out about a month or so ago about Highway 20, the ghosts of Highway 20.
Yeah.
It was amazing. It was amazing. And it gave me hope that in addition to, the resources have been shrinking. The number of reporters, we were talking in the back, we were guessing that there were about 300 reporters in the newsroom a decade ago. And now there are somewhere on the order of 70 or 80 people all told at the Oregonian. So I was impressed that they made a commitment and were willing to put the resources into the kind of long-form journalism that helps to keep people reading papers and going online.
Thanks.
I have a broader optimism that is not rooted in journalism, but in our society. And I may be entirely naive about this, but I have faith in the people of Portland, of Oregon, across the country, that they are going to not want to tolerate what the current state of the media is, the trivialization, the bias, that they will insist on truthful, accurate information to serve their needs, and it'll be up to us to respond to that. But that's where this really takes root, is what you folks decide you want collectively as a society to be an informed society. And if you want to be informed, and I believe you do, then you are what's going to empower us to do different and to do better and to serve you better.
Great. Why don't we use that as a transition? And as we transition, as you ask your question, if you could just introduce yourself and ask a fairly short question, give these guys time to answer. But as we go there, can we just say a preliminary big thanks to Kimberly, Les, and Inara.
So we are taking questions via Twitter and via text message, and that's up there on the screen. And we have a question in from Lorraine. Let's see. What kind of questions do you ask yourself to gain assurance that you're not misrepresenting stories and experiences that you are an outsider of?
You listen. You listen and you ask stupid questions and you ask obvious questions, and then you ask what you haven't asked and what you should have asked.
Yeah, I think it is about making sure that you are both clearly, taking note of what you're experiencing, but being willing to keep going back and re-asking questions too, so that you again are making sure that you're not riding on a particular, you're not having a moment where you're not seeing what you might not know.
And I'll add to that, a very important feature is when you are interviewing someone, particularly on an emotional topic or a technical topic, to stop and say, this is what I understood you to say. Do I have that right? I mean, to build to not just take the notes and, well, I have the words in my book, do I have the understanding? And if I connect with the source and I understand clearly, then I could communicate that understanding in a much more compelling way to my readers.
Hi, I'm Pete Forsyth. Journalism is often referred to as the first draft of history, and I think lately we've been hearing a whole lot of comparison between like social media and sort of the masses and citizen journalism to more traditional journalism, but in a lot of cases those can be more ephemeral. I'm curious what you think about Wikipedia. Wikipedia is something that really relies a lot on what journalists produce, as well as a lot of other sources, to try to keep something of a more lasting record. And I'm curious what opportunities or what actual positive influence you see on Wikipedia by journalism or vice versa.
So I go to Wikipedia now a lot. It always shows up in my search results when I'm looking for something, almost the first thing. But as a journalist, I never relied on what Wikipedia said. Anybody can go in and make changes, and sometimes people do it over and over. There was somebody whose age kept getting changed all the time in their profile on Wikipedia. I mean, it's fine for just, I'm curious, but I wouldn't use it as a source for journalism.
My question is for the moderator. I'm Joe Smith, and I'm one of those persons who made noise when you asked who had never been here before. And I'll preface this question, I think you have done a marvelous job, but I don't know who you are, and I think it would be useful for us to know who you are and a little bit about you.
What a journalist.
Well, thank you. I don't know who I am either. So my name's Adam Davis. I work with Oregon Humanities, and if you hang around, let's talk. How's that sound? I will. Thank you for asking. I appreciate it.
Hello, I'm Drew DeCessian, and I'm an alumna of the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication. And at the school, the journalism major is in the same school as the advertising and PR majors. And I was wondering if you could speak to that shrinking distinction, or I should say changing relationship between conventional, traditional media, or I should say reporting, and PR, and how that's delivered and what that represents.
That's great.
You answer that.
Thank you. Next question. Well, I guess I'm not quite clear on your question, so help me out a little bit. Let's have an understanding.
Well, for example, I know a few trained journalists who then became PR representatives, specifically writing news releases, and I have to think that there's a reason that trained journalists are going to the side of PR, but I'm not sure what it is and
That's a pretty
what
clear
it means for
question.
traditional journalism.
Let me take a guess.
I mean, journalism, newspaper journalism, has been a pretty uncertain place to build your life of late. And so I know lots of really experienced journalists who left newsrooms to go and do PR or do communications. It's the rote thing you do often when you leave journalism, more so I think today than ever before. And I would say usually it's a door that doesn't swing. You cross the threshold and you're in another world. And I think that that's generally appropriate, particularly as it relates to PR. Yeah, I'll leave it there. It's not every door, but I think, yeah, generally.
Do either of you want to speak to that question?
Well, I mean, I think it just makes me ask a question, which is, that also speaks to how we feel that we should be teaching journalism right now, and the university is responding to the pressures of consolidation, right, and having, being as efficient as possible in teaching these things. And so it again raises the question for me: what is our model for teaching journalism, and do we need to shift that and sort of find a way to kind of realign it? So that it's not being sort of collapsed potentially into other sort of areas that could use the same skills as journalism, versus teaching journalism that can be applied if one chooses to change their career to those other things.
Great, thank you.
Hi, my name's Natalie Sept. I'm a communications director at Alliance for Life. Having done communications work before, I wasn't aware that journalists don't actually typically report on suicide. In fact, some journalism schools say don't report on it at all. And thank you to Les Zaitz for all of your work and helping craft what's understanding with different news outlets about reporting on suicide. But that idea that something is untouchable, and granted, I think everybody just got quiet in the room, I said suicide. But what are those pieces, what roles do journalists have to advocate for public health issues where mental health and awareness does actually help in the right way when it's framed, and what things are untouchable and what's not?
Thank you.
It's a great question.
Go ahead.
She literally asked the question of you.
Oh, yeah, well. What was the question? Well, so you're asking about advocacy journalism?
And what topics are untouchable in journalism?
Untouchable? There should be no topic that's untouchable that is relevant to the community that you serve, right? There are sensitive topics. There are topics that are very challenging to present in a family newspaper, for example. But it is our duty to reflect the community. And if something is an issue or a concern or a development in the community, we have an obligation to bring our professional skill to even the most sensitive topic, to present that in a way that the community is aware of it. Because if the community is not aware of it, the community doesn't have the empowerment to do something about it.
I agree, with that in the whole, but I can think of one, for example, one tiny example over the course of going to J school and being in the newsroom, and that was, I learned in journalism school, and I went to the University of Washington, where they actually have the Center for Trauma and Reporting on Trauma, which was even nascent at that time, and had a class with the professors that were developing that program, and we were told you do not name survivors of sexual assault. That at that time was conceived of something that we do not do. We did not want to stigmatize. And we can see now that there's been a vast shift in terms of switching that around and saying, well, what if a survivor would like to be identified, right? To shift that to sort of their ability to have permission and collaboration in that particular part of the story. And with suicide in particular, I think some of this has come from, again, fears of doing something wrong on deadline, that a kind of blanket policy has emerged over time because it is thorny to do it correctly. But I can remember being encouraged by editors to do a very, very difficult story that was in the suburbs of Portland when I was at the Oregonian about, and I'm sorry if this is difficult for people, but about a young man and a friend who both tried to commit suicide at the same time, and one survived and one did not. And it was an incredibly thorny and traumatic thing to be able to try to write about. But one of the things that the editors did, which I was very grateful for, which they took time to consult with mental health professionals and other people who I could talk to about what I was hoping to write, and they could help me decide, what might be the areas where we would potentially do harm and the areas where we might be able to actually do some good in terms of community awareness about this. So I think it comes from a sort of a constant willingness to discuss and try to seek out resources who can help you find the best path forward.
I think that's really true, but I also think that there are, sorry. I think that there are also gray areas that are not bright line, like we don't talk about journalism or we don't write about, identify victims of sexual assault. There are beats or non-beats at papers all over the country covering agencies like the foster care system, like social services, where newsrooms just shy away from certain kinds of coverage. Marijuana, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, rarely covered, and yet having an integral effect on what people were doing in their lives here in Oregon. So I think that it sometimes it's just maybe it's a fear of getting it wrong, maybe it's a fear of walking down a road that might end up somewhere you don't want to be, maybe it's a fear of missing out, I don't know, but I think there are lots of little grayer areas in addition to the really bright line no-goes.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Daniel. That's really loud. I didn't work at the Oregonian. So I've lost all faith in comment sections. Why are they still on news articles at all? Like, especially local papers.
Yeah.
And I know that's an easy punch to make, but could you give me a viable, tangible good that they do? Directed at all three of you. Thanks.
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time understanding. Tell me that again.
The question about comments, I think the suggestion was they don't do any perceptible good.
Not remotely in comparison to how much bad, yeah.
Okay, so why are comment sections still there? Why are comments there?
Well, they're not on my publications, that's all I can tell you. I can't answer for the profession. I'm not sure, started Salem Reporter, 4 months ago, and in that time I've had one person ask me why don't we have an ability to comment. Otherwise it's been a non-factor, and I think there are other ways for people to express their opinions and participate and engage, short of getting into the shouting matches that comment sections typically devolve into.
I think some newspapers have a business model that each click is a monetizing effort, and so there's a disincentive to wade in and stop the nonsense. You know, better one person with an aluminum hat argue with another person with an aluminum hat all day long, and that generates an attention. But then there are also comment sections in newspapers like the New York Times that are beautiful. They give me hope because they're smart, thoughtful readers who are expressing themselves with vigor and intelligence and around issues that are complicated, and they have a large staff of people that manage that. It's a lot of resources that go into having that kind of a comment section versus a free-for-all, and I think free-for-alls are cheaper and make money, you know?
I think like to kind of turn, to kind of look at it in a sort of poetic sense, and maybe I'm not quite interpreting the early question about Wikipedia, but I'm going to choose to sort of translate that question maybe to as like places of collaboration. And I feel like in its ideal, in a poetic sense, the best comment sections are a kind of collaboration or an annotation to the story. And I wish someone more brilliant and techie could come up with a way to make that more visible, because I do think the hope is that it's the opportunity for people to be able to essentially continue the story in the comments sections, for it to go beyond simply the last sentence, or to reveal things that maybe or make things apparent that in a phone conversation with the reporter in a sort of self-serving moment might not pass along. And so it's a way to kind of backstop that in the ideal, and it would be wonderful to see if it could evolve.
And as we go to, I think, one more question, I just want to say we're going to try this, maybe 2 more questions, sorry. 5 more questions. Many more questions. That's beautiful.
This is payback for
But here's what I want to hold out is that
just
we're
one more question.
We're going to try this. Okay. Yeah, we're going to try an experiment in live reciprocal comments, even when the formal program ends, and it's going to be comments with food. And so we hope you'll stay and talk to each other in ways that resemble the sort of positive examples that were given here. So, thanks.
Thank you. I was a paper boy starting when I was 8. I collected for the Independent Journal $1.50 a month. And everybody was involved in my neighborhood. Everybody was there. Everybody paid. I find that that's no longer so. I refuse to pay the Oregonian to make myself mad at the poor journalism. But the funding model for journalism is broken. And I'd like to say I'm an aspiring poet, and I'm very good at short poems. Here's one. It's called Google. Ad infinitum.
Thank you.
So there we live. So my question is, how, since democracy cannot work if the people don't know what is so, how can we get the ethic of citizens supporting journalism to resurrect? Thank you.
Well, I wish I had the answer, but I'll go back to my first comment of the night. I subscribe to 3 local papers, and I don't always agree with them, and I don't always, find in it exactly what I want, but I feel that at least gives me the opportunity to be able to have a sort of active engagement, and that active engagement, I hope, will in some way inspire more of the work that does resonate for me. Yeah, I wish I had a powerful example, but I feel like it's like subscribe to your paper, even if you don't agree with it.
Do either of you want in on this one?
I've got about a half-hour answer. It falls on a lot of what we've said tonight. I would say 3 things. Number one, when you find a credible source of news a source of news that to you is credible, support it. Mm-hmm. Number one. Number 2, we've talked a lot about opportunities to train and train the new generation of journalists and reporters. There are ways that you can support that particular type of work. Number 3, we're increasingly seeing models where where patrons can support a particular project. Whether it is like in my community, we're going to be working on reporting on the Latino population. That's a discrete topic that if you believe is important, you could support. So there are ways that you as citizens can vote with your support to encourage and sustain and sort of provide for a future for the type of journalism and information that you want.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Kieran. Kind of piggybacking on the poet's question. Les, you started a newspaper, and you said that, well, a crucial part of it is to get folks in Salem invested to pay for their service. I feel like that's, well, it has been a core issue of journalism in the past several years since the internet has been providing journalism people can get for free. How do you propose that you will get people in Salem and beyond to invest in your paper in order to make it sustainable?
Okay. So help me, frankly, I didn't hear that entire question, the last part of that.
How will you get people to invest in your paper, essentially? How do you get people to pay for the journalism that you're going to be writing in Salem?
Well, it's a pretty simple bargain, frankly. We will provide the information that our experience tells us readers want, that our engagement with the community tells us people want, and then we are very clear with people that if you want this type of journalism, you need to support it. We're not going to go door to door. We're not going to beg. We're not going to do a charity drive and say, just help us. This is in your self-interest. If you want this, you will support it.
Big organizations like the New York Times and the Guardian have been doing the same thing. How will you be different? People aren't paying for that. You know what I mean?
Actually,
Kimberly?
A little bit.
so I subscribe to the Guardian, I pay the Guardian, and I subscribe to the New York Times and the Washington Post. I pay because that content is valuable to me. In the same way that you might buy an app that you download on your phone, it would never occur to me that I would choose to prefer an app that had lots of ads or that was not what I needed. I would pay for the thing that I wanted. And I think that's the formula that we lost when news organizations gave their content away, and then only after that horse was fully out of the barn said, oh, well, do you want to pay for this thing we've been giving you? And I think the danger, I think the value of what you're doing in Salem is the recognition that if you have it and you say it must be paid for, people figure it out. It's not expensive.
Yep.
And the return is you're informed, maybe you're amused, maybe you're angered, but you're learning something that you want to know.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm short. So I work in an entirely different area. I'm a physician and public health person, and I work in sort of health communication as a public health person too. So that's my professional background. But I keep coming back to the concept about common and public discourse and how we don't have that. And certainly I'm not blaming it on papers, but it's fascinating to me. You said you get up and get the paper. I think that means you actually go outside and pick up the physical paper. And I have been doing that forever. Because to me, when I'm flipping those pages, my eyes are lighting on articles that I wouldn't normally read. Whereas when I read the same thing online, it's clear to me that the content is I'm seeing things, but I'm not seeing them in the same way. And I worry about that a great deal. And I've sort of talked to people about this over the years, and there's one guy I was talking to on an airplane about a couple of years back, and he said, oh, that's easy to fix. You can reintroduce chaos into your feed. And I said, do you understand what you said? And he looked at me blankly. And so, I'm not blaming newspapers for the lack of public discourse. I think this is it's a much bigger thing, but if you're not reading the paper in its physical form, and I have to say I've just given up on one because the fact I was killing trees finally got to me, but how do we get that? How do we try to create that?
Thank you.
Good question.
How do you reintroduce chaos into your feed?
I mean, I think I think tools like social media, like Twitter, can be really helpful. I follow a ton of journalists from all over the world. I follow activists in the Maldives. I follow writers in Haiti. I follow things that are interesting to me, and that creates a soup of news that I can consume that is much broader than it would be if I just went to the New York Times app in the morning. They send me places that I probably wouldn't have gone even if I had the paper in my hands.
And as just a consumer, not a producer, I can just say I came to Twitter extremely reluctantly, incompetently, and late. But one thing that I've found really useful about it is it's actually a pretty easy way to follow perspectives that I find contemptible and hard to understand. Is that I can deliberately follow people that I would never otherwise read. It's actually much easier to do that and to get a sense of the arguments that are different from mine. And I can moderate how far I want to go with that or not. So I think there are ways to deliberately cultivate that. Maybe we're going to I don't want to speak incorrectly. Is this our last question? Or? All right, last question. Great, thank you. Yes. Bring it home.
I can tell you're getting antsy for those snacks, so just bear with me.
Thank
I have
you.
a comment/question. I just was thinking about something that you said earlier that I think is really commonly told to young journalists of color. I'm a journalism student myself. Very early on in what I hope is a career, that we're gonna be the voice for the voiceless. You know, I even wrote it on my college application. That's always what people were telling me. And in the last year, I kind of realized that's like a really shitty thing to say. Yes. Sorry. But yeah, and I felt really arrogant walking back into my community being like, here, I'm gonna write this for you because you all have no voice. And I know it's just a saying, but recently someone told me, and I just wanted to offer this to you because I think you're all in teaching positions, that it's more about passing the mic, and that the communities that we're a part of or entering, they've been talking, but there's been no mic. And so I think that's great.
Thank you.
Love it.
And then I promise I'll talk fast. A question. I recently read this, or a few months ago, this article, I think it was in the Columbia Journalism Review, about how when you're a journalist of color, you have two jobs. You're also a reporter, you cover your beat and all that, but then you have to be in charge of diversifying the newsroom, which I've definitely encountered already, and it's kind of sucks, you know. Of course I care, and I want to amplify other people of color and bring in other marginalized communities, but I realized I was doing more of that than getting my tuition's worth money of my education, right? Doing less reporting and editing and more, how are we gonna do outreach for other students? And so I guess what I'm asking is, what does that look like in real life? You know, I'm trying to get back into school. But I spent my last year doing that at a college paper, and it was really horrible. And I really expected more. And so what does that look like in the positions that you're in now in diversifying the newsroom and amplifying other people and bringing them up to where you are?
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a really fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and jump on this one. This was there for you. I feel like it's not just newsrooms. Hopefully you won't find yourself in your long career having to do what you just described every place you go. But for people of my generation, that's been a given, and depending on what environment you're putting yourself into, you're often having to be, or expected to be, or people imagine that you will be an ambassador, or that you're representing something on behalf of the people that they didn't hire. And if you work better places, that happens less. If you work places that value diversity in a real genuine way, and you're never alone, then that becomes less of a factor in how you live your life and how you go about your workday. Little plug for Meyer Memorial Trust. It's the foundation Fred Meyer set up before he died 36 years ago. It started, and it is an organization of about 41 people, and more than half are people of color. Its entire leadership team is all women. More than half are people of color. I'm working in an environment where I don't have to experience what you're describing. And so there are places. Sadly, most newsrooms are not those places. they even maybe have been in the past more diverse, but as they've shrunk, they've become ever less diverse. So I think you're probably describing a situation that exists in a lot of newsrooms today.
There's a growing awareness that we need to be very, very conscious of making sure that we are not omitting voices and perspectives from coverage of news, but at the same time, for those who are often in positions, whether it's in academia or in newsrooms, might be able to get on board with that, but they're not aware that it requires inclusion, right? Not just the question of diversity, but looking for ways that you make sure when people come on board that they're not feeling like simply they represent diversity, that they are absolutely included.
So we are going to drop these mics now. We're going to put them down. And as a way of doing that, I guess I want to first just point you to the remainder of the series. Omar Ellicott is going to be in a couple months, an Oregonian who's both a journalist and a novelist. And we're going to conclude the series with Danielle Allen. I don't know if you have yet run into Danielle Allen, but I hope you will run into her here. She's writing for the Washington Post and writing all sorts of amazing books, and we hope you'll consider joining us for these. There are conversation projects around the state where we can talk a little more interactively in a way about some of this stuff, and we really strongly encourage you to stay longer here, talk especially with people you don't know, or talk a little differently with people you do know that you came with. We have a prompt which you could either go with or totally disregard, and that's to just talk about where you get your news and why, and whether that's changed over the last several years. Before we formally call this, a reminder that Inara is going to be signing books, I think out front there.
Okay.
I think. We'll figure it out. And Kimberly and Les will be here to continue to talk with. And please, just for now, a big thanks both for your conversation here and the work you're doing in the world. Thanks so much.